The morning arrives slowly over Crete. Light spills across the northern coast in long golden bands, touching the olive groves first. Then the low hills covered in wild thyme and sage. And finally the mountains that rise in the island's interior, like the spine of some ancient creature turned to stone. The air is still cool, carrying the scent of the sea, salt and distance, and the faint mineral tang of limestone cliffs, weathered by millennia of wind. In the quiet hours before the day fully wakes, you can walk the paths around Knossos, and feel the weight of absence, the presence of something that was once here and is no longer, except in fragments, in whispers, in the stones themselves. The ruins stand on a low hill, surrounded by cypresses, and the sprawl of modern Heracleion creeping outward from the coast. The palace of Knossos is not what it once was. Much of what you see today is reconstruction. Concrete columns painted a deep ochre red, frescoes restored and replicated, walls rebuilt to suggest the grandeur of rooms that collapsed 3,500 years ago. Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who excavated this place beginning in 1900, did not simply uncover the past, he reimagined it, imposing his vision of what a Bronze Age palace should look like onto the broken stones and scattered pottery shards. Some call his work a triumph of archaeological imagination, others call it a beautiful fiction. The truth, as with most things concerning the Minoans, lies somewhere in between, elusive and contested, requiring patience to approach. But beneath the reconstructions, beneath the tourism and the modern interpretations, there is something older. The original stones are still here, massive blocks of gypsum and limestone, fitted together with a precision that suggests both skill and purpose. The drains still run beneath the courtyards, engineering marvels from an age when most of Europe lived in timber halls and thatched round houses. The storerooms, long and narrow, still bear the marks where enormous clay jars once stood, pithoi taller than a man, filled with oil and wine and grain. You can see the depressions in the floor where they rested, the stone platforms that kept them stable. The palace was not just a residence, it was a nerve center, a place where goods were collected, redistributed, accounted for in scripts we still cannot fully read. It was a theater for rituals we can only guess at, ceremonies involving bull leaping and processions and offerings to gods whose names we do not know. To stand in the central courtyard of Knossos on a quiet morning is to stand at the threshold of Europe's first great civilization. The Minoans, as Evans named them, after the legendary King Minos of Greek myth, were not the first people to live on Crete. The island had been inhabited since the Neolithic, since farmers first crossed the sea with their seeds and livestock, settling in caves and building the first villages. But the Minoans were the first to build something recognizable as a state, a complex society organized around monumental architecture, written records and networks of trade that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. They were the first in Europe to develop a script, to construct multi-story buildings, to engage in diplomacy and commerce on a scale that connected them to Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean Islands. They were, in a very real sense, the beginning, and yet, for all their achievements, the Minoans remain enigmatic. We do not know what they called themselves. We cannot read their earliest writing. Their language, preserved in the script known as Linear A, is still undeciphered, locked away in clay tablets that record transactions and inventories in a tongue that may not be related to any language spoken today. Even their end is shrouded in uncertainty. Around 1450 BC, the palaces of Crete, Knossos, Phastos, Malia, Zakros, were destroyed. Some burned, some were abandoned. Knossos alone survived, rebuilt and occupied by Mycenaean Greeks, whose Linear B script we can read, revealing a final chapter of administration and decline before the palace, too, was consumed by fire around 1380 BC. After that, silence. The palaces were never rebuilt. Crete faded from prominence, becoming a backwater of the late Bronze Age, remembered only in the myths of later Greeks, who spoke of King Minos, the labyrinth, and the Minotaur. But before the end, there were 1,000 years of brilliance. 1,000 years, when Crete was the center of the Aegean world, when its ships sailed to every corner of the eastern Mediterranean, when its artists created frescoes of astonishing beauty and naturalism, when its architects designed buildings that still confound us with their complexity. The Minoans built a civilization that was, in many ways, unique, less militaristic than the warrior cultures that would follow, more focused on trade and ceremony, on the rhythms of agriculture and the sacred presence believed to dwell in mountains, caves, and the depths of the sea. The island itself shaped them. Crete is the largest of the Greek islands, stretching over 160 miles from east to west, a long spine of mountains running down its center. The White Mountains in the west rise to over 8,000 feet, their peaks often dusted with snow even in spring. The Dictaean Lasithi ranges in the east are lower, but no less dramatic, riddled with caves that have been used for burials and rituals since the Neolithic. The island's coasts are varied, steep cliffs in the south, gentler harbours in the north, beaches of fine sand and black volcanic rock. Fertile plains spread between the mountains, rich soil washed down from the highlands, perfect for olives, grapes, and grain. The climate is Mediterranean, mild and wet in winter, hot and dry in summer, tempered always by the sea. The sea is everywhere on Crete, even in the island's interior. In the high villages and mountain plateaus, you can feel its presence. The way the light changes when clouds move in from the coast, the faint taste of salt in the air after a storm. For the Minoans, the sea was not a barrier, but a highway, the means by which they connected to the wider world. Crete sits at a crossroads. To the south lies Libya and the coast of North Africa. To the east, Cyprus and the Levant. To the north, the Cyclades and mainland Greece. To the west, the long reach of the Mediterranean, opening toward Italy and beyond. The Minoans learned to navigate these waters, to read the winds and stars, to build ships capable of carrying cargo across hundreds of miles of open sea. In doing so, they became the first great maritime civilization of Europe, the first to understand that control of the sea meant access to wealth, knowledge, and power. Walking through the ruins of Knossos, through the columned halls and storage magazines, through the throne room with its alabaster chair still in place, you can begin to imagine the world the Minoans built. It was a world of ceremony and administration, of scribes recording the movement of goods, of priests and priestesses performing rituals in shrines filled with sacred symbols. It was a world where art mattered, where craftsmen were valued, where the walls of palaces were covered not with images of conquest and war, but with dolphins and lilies, griffins and saffron gatherers, young men leaping over bulls in displays of skill and courage. It was a world that lasted 1,000 years and then vanished, leaving behind only ruins, myths and questions. This is the story of that world. It is a story written in stone and clay, in frescoes and seals, in the traces left by ships that sailed long ago and returned laden with copper and tin, ivory and gold. It is a story of emergence and flowering, of catastrophe and resilience, of a civilization that rose on an island, at the edge of memory, and shaped the course of European history, in ways that echo still. It begins not with palaces, but with the slow accumulation of centuries, with farmers and potters, with villages and graves, with the deep roots from which the Minoans would grow. Long before the first palace rose at Knossos, Crete was a land of small settlements, scattered across the island's valleys and coastal plains. These were farming communities, modest in scale, their houses built of stone and mud brick, their lives governed by the rhythms of planting and harvest, by the turning of seasons and the needs of livestock. The people who lived here, in the 3rd millennium BC, were not yet the Minoans of legend. They had no palaces, no monumental architecture, no written records, but they were the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The long, slow centuries during which the character of Cretan civilization began to take shape. The island had been inhabited for thousands of years before the Bronze Age began. The first settlers arrived during the Neolithic, perhaps as early as 7000 BC, crossing the sea from Anatolia in small boats, bringing with them seeds of wheat and barley, sheep and goats, the knowledge of farming that would transform the island. They settled in caves at first. Crete is riddled with caves, deep limestone chambers, carved by water over millennia, cool and dry, perfect for storage and shelter. Gradually, they built villages, clusters of rectangular houses, with stone foundations and flat roofs, organized around courtyards, where work was done, where children played, where the community gathered. These early Cretans made pottery, simple vessels, shaped by hand, decorated with incised patterns or left plain. They carved figurines from stone and clay, images of women with exaggerated hips and breasts, possibly fertility symbols, possibly representations of a goddess. They buried their dead in collective tombs, sometimes in caves, sometimes in circular stone structures, called tholos tombs, a tradition that would continue for thousands of years. By the time the Bronze Age began, around 3000 BC, the island's population was growing. New settlements appeared, some of them quite large, with hundreds of inhabitants. Pottery became more sophisticated, shaped on slow wheels, decorated with dark geometric patterns on a light background. Metalworking arrived. Copper first, brought from Cyprus or Anatolia, smelted and cast into simple tools and ornaments. The Cretans learned to alloy copper with tin to make bronze, harder and more durable, useful for tools and weapons alike. Bronze changed everything. It required trade, because tin was not available on Crete. It had to be imported, carried across the sea from distant sources, perhaps Anatolia, perhaps even further afield. Bronze demanded organization, specialists who knew how to smelt and cast, merchants who could arrange the exchange of goods. It created wealth, because bronze objects were valuable, and those who controlled access to metal could accumulate power. The early Minoan period, as archaeologists call the centuries from 3000 to 2000 BC, was a time of gradual transformation. The island's settlements grew larger and more complex. Some, like Vasiliki in the east and Myrtos in the south, developed into substantial towns, with narrow winding streets, houses packed tightly together, communal ovens and wells. The people of these towns made distinctive pottery, burnished to a high sheen, decorated with mottled patterns created by uneven firing, what archaeologists call Vasiliki ware, elegant and strange, unlike anything made elsewhere in the Aegean. They made jewelry from gold and silver, necklaces and bracelets, beads of carnelian and amethyst. They carved seals from soft stone, tiny masterpieces of craftsmanship, engraved with images of animals, ships, abstract symbols. These seals were used to mark ownership, pressed into clay to seal jars or document transactions. They are some of the earliest evidence of administration, of a society beginning to keep records, to formalize relationships of property and exchange. Trade networks expanded. Cretan pottery appears in the Cycladic Islands, those rocky outcrops scattered across the southern Aegean. Cycladic figurines, marble sculptures of abstract human forms, appear in Cretan tombs, evidence of contact and exchange. Obsidian from the island of Melos, volcanic glass, prized for its sharpness, was imported to Crete and worked into blades. Egyptian stone vessels, carved from hard stones like diorite and porphyry, have been found in Cretan burials, proof that even in these early centuries, Crete was connected to the great civilizations of the Near East. The sea was becoming a highway, and the Cretans were learning to navigate it. Religion in this period is difficult to reconstruct. We have no texts, no myths written down. Only the material remains, figurines, shrines, tombs. Caves seem to have been sacred spaces. Several caves in Crete show evidence of ritual activity dating back to the Neolithic and continuing through the Bronze Age. Offerings of pottery and figurines, animal bones from sacrifices, votive objects, left in hope of divine favor. Mountains, too, were sacred. Peak sanctuaries, small shrines built on high summits, would become a distinctive feature of Minoan religion in later centuries, but their origins may lie here, in the early Bronze Age, when people climbed the peaks to leave offerings, to commune with gods or spirits, believed to dwell in the heights. The dead were honored in communal tombs, their bones mingled together, buried with pottery and jewelry, tools and weapons. Death was not the end, but a transition, the deceased joining their ancestors in a collective afterlife, still connected to the living through ritual and memory. The landscape of early Minoan Crete was not the carefully terraced hillsides and ordered olive groves of later centuries. It was wilder, more forested, though even then the island's ecology was shaped by human activity. Trees were cut for timber, for shipbuilding, for fuel to smelt bronze. Goats and sheep grazed the hillsides, preventing the regeneration of forests, creating the scrubby maquis vegetation that covers much of the Mediterranean today. But there were still oak and cypress forests in the mountains, stands of pine on the high slopes, wetlands along the coasts where reeds grew and birds nested. The Cretans lived close to the land, their survival dependent on the harvest, on the rains that watered their fields, on the health of their flocks. They knew the cycles of the seasons intimately, when to plant, when to prune, when to gather wild herbs and fruits. They knew the sea as well, its moods and dangers, the routes between islands, the safe harbors and treacherous currents. By the end of the third millennium, something was changing. Settlements were growing into towns, and some towns were beginning to stand out as centers of wealth and power. Knossos, already occupied since the Neolithic, was expanding, its houses spreading across the low hill that would one day hold the palace. Phenistos in the south, overlooking the fertile Messara plain, was also growing, Malia on the north coast, Zakros in the east. All of these places were becoming focal points, nodes in networks of trade and production, places where goods were collected and redistributed, where craftsmen worked, where elites were beginning to emerge. We can see the beginnings of social stratification in the burials. Some tombs contain far more wealth than others: gold jewelry, imported objects, finely made pottery. These were not kings yet, but they were leaders, individuals, or families who had accumulated enough wealth and influence to set themselves apart. They may have been traders, controlling access to metals and foreign goods. They may have been religious leaders, mediating between the community and the divine. They may have been simply the best farmers, the most successful herders, their wealth rooted in the land. Whatever the source of their power, it was growing, concentrating in certain places, in certain hands. And then around 2000 BC, the palaces appeared. The transformation was sudden, at least in archaeological terms. Within a generation or two, massive new buildings were constructed at Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and perhaps elsewhere. These were not ordinary houses, or even large communal structures. They were palaces, vast complexes organized around central courtyards, with hundreds of rooms, elaborate architecture, sophisticated drainage systems, storage facilities capable of holding tons of goods. The appearance of the palaces marks the beginning of a new era, the moment when Crete crossed the threshold into something recognizably civilized in the traditional sense, centralized, literate, monumental. But that transformation did not come from nowhere. It was built on the foundations of 1,000 years of gradual development, on the slow accumulation of trade networks and craft specialization, on the deepening of social hierarchies, on the wealth generated by bronze and the sea. The early Minoan period was the root system, hidden beneath the soil, from which the great flowering of the palace age would grow. Around the year 2000 BC, the first great palaces rose on Crete. They appeared at Knossos in the north, Phaistos in the south, Malia on the coast to the east of Knossos, and later at Zakros on the island's far eastern shore. These were not fortresses. They had no defensive walls, no battlements, no obvious military architecture. They were something else entirely: administrative centers, ceremonial complexes, storage depots, residences for elites, workshops for craftsmen, and temples for gods whose names we do not know. The palaces were the physical embodiment of a new kind of power, one based not on conquest but on control of resources, of trade, of ritual, of the symbolic and the sacred. To walk through the ruins of Knossos today is to enter a labyrinth. The palace sprawls across the low hill, a maze of corridors and stairways, courtyards and storage rooms, halls and shrines. Arthur Evans called it the labyrinth, identifying it with the mythical maze built by Daedalus to house the Minotaur. The connection is tempting, even if it is ultimately unprovable. The word labyrinth itself may derive from labris, the double-headed axe that was a sacred symbol for the Minoans, images of which appear throughout the palace on pillars and pottery, seals and frescoes. If the palace of Knossos is the labyrinth, then it is a labyrinth, not of stone walls and dead ends, but of meaning, layers upon layers of function and symbolism. Architecture designed not for clarity, but for complexity, for the interweaving of the mundane and the sacred. The layout of the palace is organized around a central courtyard, a large open space oriented roughly north-south, paved with stone, surrounded on all sides by the multi-story buildings of the complex. This courtyard was the heart of the palace, the stage upon which ceremonies were performed, processions enacted, rituals carried out in view of the assembled community. On the west side of the courtyard, a series of shrines and cult rooms, their walls decorated with frescoes, their floors bearing the marks of offering tables and libation vessels. On the east, the residential quarters, private rooms for the elite, complete with sophisticated plumbing, bathrooms with terracotta tubs, toilets with drains, a system of clay pipes that carried water and waste away from the living areas. To the north and south, workshops and storage magazines, long narrow rooms lined with enormous clay jars, pithoi, some of them taller than a man, capable of holding hundreds of liters of oil or wine or grain. The palace was built of stone, limestone and gypsum, quarried from the island's hills, and timber. Wooden columns supported the upper floors, their bases resting on stone plinths, their shafts tapering downward in an unusual inverted design, thicker at the top than the bottom. The columns were painted, most likely red, with black capitals, a color scheme Evans recreated in his reconstructions, though the original pigments have long since faded. The walls were plastered and painted as well, covered with frescoes that depicted scenes of court life, religious rituals, and the natural world, dolphins swimming in blue seas, lilies and crocuses, blooming in gardens, griffins and sphinxes, guarding sacred spaces, young men and women engaged in the dangerous sport of bull leaping. Bull leaping, or taurokathepsia, is one of the most iconic images of Minoan culture. The frescoes show acrobats, both male and female, grasping the horns of a charging bull, vaulting over its back, landing behind it in a display of agility and courage. Whether this was a sport, a ritual, or both is unclear. Bulls were sacred to the Minoans, symbols of fertility and power, their horns abstracted into the horns of consecration that appear on altars and rooftops throughout the palace. Bull sacrifice was almost certainly part of religious ceremonies, and bull leaping may have been a way of demonstrating human mastery over this powerful animal, or perhaps of honoring it, engaging with its strength in a controlled, ritualized way. The palace was not just a place of ceremony, it was also an economic engine, a node in networks of production and trade that stretched across the island and beyond. The storage magazines held vast quantities of goods: olive oil, wine, grain, honey, wool, flax. These were not simply the provisions of the palace's inhabitants. The palace economy was redistributive, a system in which goods flowed inward to the center and then outward again, supporting craftsmen and administrators, funding ceremonies and construction, enabling trade with foreign lands. The administration of this complex economy required record keeping, and so the Minoans developed writing. The earliest script, which appears around the same time as the first palaces, is called Cretan hieroglyphic. It consists of pictographic signs, images of objects, animals, and abstract symbols, inscribed on clay tablets, seals, and roundels. A later script, Linear A, emerged around 1800 BC and became the primary administrative script of the palaces. Linear A is more abstract than the hieroglyphic script, its signs simplified and stylized, easier to write quickly. Thousands of Linear A tablets have been found, mostly at Knossos, but also at other palace sites. They record inventories: so many jars of oil, so many sheep, so many units of grain. They list offerings to deities, whose names appear as single words or symbols, tantalizingly unreadable. Linear A has never been deciphered. The language it records is unknown, not Greek, possibly not even Indo-European. The tablets are readable in the sense that we can identify numerals and some ideograms, but the phonetic values of the signs remain uncertain, and the grammar and vocabulary of the language are lost. The palaces were not isolated. They were connected to the surrounding landscape by a network of roads and smaller settlements, villas, farms, towns. Some of these secondary sites were quite elaborate, miniature palaces in their own right, suggesting that power was not entirely centralized, but distributed among regional elites who owed allegiance to the palace, but maintained their own authority. The villa at Agirtriada, near Phaistos, is one such site, a beautifully constructed complex, with frescoes, storage rooms, and administrative tablets of its own. The town of Gornia, on the north coast, was a thriving community of artisans and traders, its narrow streets lined with workshops where pottery was made, textiles woven, metals worked. Religion permeated every aspect of palace life. The distinction between sacred and secular, so familiar to us, seems not to have existed for the Minoans. The palace itself was a sacred space, its architecture designed to facilitate rituals, its storerooms holding offerings for the gods. Shrines were found throughout the palace, small rooms with benches for offerings, niches for sacred objects, altars for libations. The symbols of Minoan religion appear everywhere: the double axe, the horns of consecration, the sacred pillar, the snake goddess. Figurines of women holding snakes, bare-breasted and crowned, have been found in shrines, possibly representations of a goddess or of priestesses performing her rites. Caves and peak sanctuaries in the mountains continued to be important, places where offerings were made, where the divine was believed to be especially present. The first palace period, from roughly 2000 to 1700 BC, was a time of prosperity and stability. The palaces grew and were elaborated, trade expanded, Minoan pottery and other goods spread throughout the Aegean and beyond, evidence of commercial networks that connected Crete to Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Greek mainland. The island's population grew, its towns flourished, its craftsmen produced works of astonishing beauty: gold jewelry, stone vessels carved from hard stones with extraordinary precision, seal stones engraved with intricate scenes. And then, around 1700 BC, disaster struck. The palaces were destroyed by earthquake, most likely, though the evidence is not conclusive. Knossos burned, Phaistos was damaged, Malea and Zakros suffered as well. The destruction was widespread, affecting not just the palaces but towns and villas across the island. It was a catastrophe, but not an ending. The Minoans rebuilt. Within a generation, new palaces rose on the ruins of the old, grander and more elaborate than before. The Second Palace period had begun, and with it, the golden age of Minoan civilization. The palace at its height was a world unto itself, a city contained within walls, that were not defensive but symbolic, marking the boundary between the sacred precinct and the profane world beyond. To enter the palace was to step into a space where every corridor, every room, every object had meaning layered upon meaning, economic, religious, political. The central courtyard, broad and open to the sky, was the stage for public ceremony. Here, processions wound their way from the entrance, bearing offerings of oil and wine, grain and animals, gifts for the gods and for the palace itself. Here, on certain festival days, the bull leaping would take place, young men and women risking their lives in a performance that was half sport, half sacred rite, while the court watched from the colonnaded porticos that surrounded the space. The frescoes that covered the walls of the palace offer glimpses into this world, though they are glimpses filtered through time. Their colors faded, their scenes incomplete. In the so-called procession fresco, dozens of figures move in a line, carrying libation vessels and musical instruments, dressed in elaborate costumes, men in kilts and belts, women in flounced skirts and tight bodices, their hair adorned with flowers and ribbons. They are beautiful, these painted figures, slender and graceful, their skin painted in the conventions of Egyptian art. Men dark, women pale, but their style is distinctly Minoan, fluid and naturalistic, focused not on rigid formality, but on movement and life. In the Queen's Megaron, a room Arthur Evans identified as part of the royal residence, dolphins leap across the walls, their bodies arcing through waves, rendered in flowing blue and white. The room is small, intimate, a private space away from the public grandeur of the courtyards and halls. Nearby, a bathroom, complete with a terracotta tub, and a drain that led waste away through the palace's plumbing system. The Minoans were fastidious about cleanliness, about the flow of water, about separating the pure from the polluted. Ritual purity was central to their religion, and the palace's elaborate water management systems, cisterns and aqueducts, drains and toilets, served both practical and symbolic purposes. Daily life in the palace revolved around rhythms of work and ritual. Scribes sat in small rooms, clay tablets spread before them, styluses in hand, recording the movement of goods. So many jars of oil, delivered from the countryside. So many sheep sheared for wool. So many offerings presented at the shrine of the goddess, whose name we cannot read. The tablets are terse, bureaucratic, concerned with quantities and inventories, but they reveal a world of astonishing organization, a state capable of mobilizing resources on a large scale, of feeding and clothing hundreds of people, of supporting craftsmen and administrators, priests and priestesses. The craftsmen of the palace were masters of their trades. In the workshops attached to the palace complex, goldsmiths worked thin sheets of gold into intricate jewelry, necklaces and earrings, bracelets and diadems, decorated with granulation and filigree. Techniques borrowed perhaps from Egypt or the Near East, but executed with a distinctly Minoan sensibility. Stone carvers shaped vessels from hard stones, obsidian and rock crystal, serpentine and marble, grinding and polishing them to a mirror finish. Some of these vessels are so thin, so delicate, that light passes through them. They are works of art, but also ritual objects, used in ceremonies, filled with offerings, placed in shrines and tombs. Potters threw clay on wheels, shaping vessels with confident hands, decorating them with images drawn from the natural world. The pottery of the Second Palace period is among the finest ever produced in the ancient world. The so-called marine style, which flourished around 1500 BC, features designs of octopuses and argonauts, dolphins and starfish, seaweed and coral, all rendered with a lively naturalism that seems to capture the movement of the sea itself. These vessels were not mass-produced. Each one was crafted individually, the designs painted freehand, no two exactly alike. They were luxury goods, made for the palace elite, for export to foreign courts, for use in ceremonies where beauty and craftsmanship mattered. Religion was not separate from this daily life, but woven into it. The palace was a religious institution, as much as it was an administrative one. The shrines scattered throughout the complex, small rooms with benches for offerings, niches for sacred objects, altars for libations, were in constant use. Priestesses, identifiable in frescoes and figurines by their elaborate costumes and sacred gestures, performed rituals, poured libations, burned incense, presented offerings to the gods. The gods themselves are difficult to discern. We have no Minoan myths written down, no theology, no cosmology. What we have are symbols, the double axe, the horns of consecration, the sacred pillar, the snake, the bird. We have figurines, the snake goddess, with her arms raised, serpents coiling around her wrists, the poppy goddess, her crown adorned with opium poppy capsules, suggesting rituals involving altered states of consciousness. The bull was central to Minoan religion, as the frescoes of bull leaping attest. But the bull was not the only sacred animal. Birds appear frequently in religious contexts. Doves and eagles, perhaps messengers of the divine, perhaps manifestations of the goddess herself. Snakes, creatures of the earth and the underworld, were associated with fertility, with the cycles of death and rebirth. The Minoans seem to have worshipped a goddess or goddesses connected to nature, to fertility, to the life-giving forces of earth and sea. Some scholars have argued for a single great goddess, a mother deity who presided over all aspects of life. Others see a more complex pantheon, multiple deities with specific domains and attributes. The truth is lost, hidden in the symbols and the silence. Caves remain sacred, just as they had been in earlier centuries. The cave of Kamares, high on the southern slopes of Mount Ida, was a major pilgrimage site, accessible only by a steep and difficult climb. Thousands of pottery vessels have been found there, offerings left by worshippers over centuries. The pottery is exquisite, decorated with delicate white and red designs on a black background, the so-called Kamares ware that gives the cave its name. Other caves, like the Dictaean cave in the Larzathi Plateau, were associated with birth and initiation, places where the divine was believed to dwell in the darkness beneath the earth. Peak sanctuaries, small shrines built on mountain summits, were another distinctive feature of Minoan religion. These were not elaborate buildings, just simple structures, sometimes no more than a low wall enclosing an altar, but their locations were dramatic. High places where earth met sky, where the view stretched for miles, where the worshipper stood exposed to wind and sun, and the presence of the divine. Offerings at peak sanctuaries included figurines of humans and animals, pottery vessels, bronze objects. The act of climbing the mountain, of making the difficult journey to the summit, was itself a form of devotion, a physical ordeal that brought the worshipper closer to the gods. The agricultural cycle structured the year, and religious festivals marked its turning points. The spring, when the fields greened and the sheep lambed, was a time of renewal, of offerings to ensure fertility. The summer harvest, when grain was gathered and threshed, was a time of thanksgiving, of presenting the first fruits to the gods. The autumn, when olives were pressed and grapes crushed, was a time of abundance, of feasting and celebration. The winter, when the earth rested, was a time of darkness and waiting, of rituals to ensure the sun's return. We can only guess at the specific festivals, the myths that were told, the songs that were sung, but the rhythms were universal, the same patterns that governed agricultural societies everywhere, planting and harvest, birth and death, the cycles of the seasons turning endlessly. Life in the palace was not all ritual and ceremony. There was pleasure too, leisure, the enjoyment of beauty for its own sake. The frescoes depict gardens, carefully cultivated spaces filled with flowers, lilies and crocuses, irises and roses. Music was important. Lilies and flutes appear in frescoes, and as archaeological finds, instruments of bone and bronze, their sounds lost but their presence testifying to a culture that valued music, that sang and danced, that used rhythm and melody to mark time and celebrate life. Games were played, board games, carved from ivory and stone, their rules forgotten but their elaborateness suggesting strategic complexity. The palace was a place of refinement, of culture, of a civilization that had moved beyond mere survival to create something beautiful, something lasting. And yet, beneath the beauty, there was always the shadow of the bull, the danger and the sacrifice, the acknowledgement that life was fragile, that the earth could shake, and the palaces fall, that the gods demanded offerings and sometimes demanded blood. Crete sits at the center of the eastern Mediterranean, a stepping stone between continents. To the south, less than 200 miles across the Libyan Sea, lies the coast of North Africa. To the east, Cyprus and the Levantine shore, the great cities of Ugarit and Byblos, the cedars of Lebanon. To the north, the Aegean archipelago, islands scattered like stones across blue water, and beyond them, the Greek mainland, rugged and mountainous, home to the emerging Mycenaean kingdoms. To the west, the long expanse of the Mediterranean, opening toward Sicily and the Italian peninsula, toward the unknown reaches of the Western Sea. The Minoans understood that their future lay on the water. The island's resources were limited: olive oil and wine, wool and timber, pottery and textiles. But the sea offered access to resources Crete lacked: copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia or beyond, gold and ivory from Egypt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, via the trade networks of the Near East. The Minoans became traders, shipbuilders, navigators. They developed vessels capable of crossing hundreds of miles of open water, ships with keels and sails, capable of carrying tons of cargo. We have images of these ships in frescoes and on seal stones, sleek hulls with high prows and sterns, single masts with square sails, banks of oars for when the wind failed. The evidence for Minoan trade is everywhere. Minoan pottery, especially the elegant marine style and floral style wares of the late Palace period, has been found across the eastern Mediterranean. In Egypt, at sites like Tel El Dubba in the Nile Delta, entire rooms have been uncovered with frescoes in the Minoan style, bull-leaping scenes and griffins, evidence of either Minoan artists working abroad or Egyptian patrons adopting Minoan aesthetics. Egyptian stone vessels, carved from hard stones, appear in Cretan palaces and tombs. Scarabs bearing the names of Egyptian pharaohs have been found at Knossos. The connection between Crete and Egypt was strong, sustained over centuries, based on mutual benefit. Crete offered wine and oil, fine pottery and textiles, in exchange for gold and ivory, exotic goods from the Nile Valley and beyond. The relationship with the Near East was equally important. At Ugarit on the Syrian coast, Minoan pottery has been found in quantity. Cylinder seals from Mesopotamia appear in Crete, evidence of trade networks that stretched far inland, connecting the Aegean to the great cities of the Fertile Crescent. The Minoans adopted some Near Eastern technologies: the potter's wheel, certain metalworking techniques, possibly elements of their writing systems. But they did not simply copy. They adapted, transformed, made these technologies their own, blending influences into something distinctively Minoan. Cyprus was a crucial node in these networks. The island was rich in copper, and controlling access to Cypriot copper meant controlling the supply of bronze. Minoan presence on Cyprus is attested archaeologically. Pottery, seals, even architectural elements that suggest Minoan influence, or perhaps Minoan settlements. The relationship was complex, probably involving both trade and some degree of political or economic control. By the late Palace period, Crete and Cyprus were deeply interconnected, part of the same web of commerce that linked the Aegean to the Near East. Closer to home, the Cycladic islands were firmly within the Minoan orbit. Islands like Thera, Melos, Kera, Melos, Kera, and Kythera show strong Minoan influence in the Second Palace period. At Akrotiri, on Thera, a town was buried by volcanic ash around 1628 BC, preserving it like a snapshot frozen in time. The architecture is Minoan: multi-story buildings, sophisticated plumbing, frescoes on the walls. The pottery is Minoan. The culture was Minoan, or at least heavily influenced by Minoan norms. Whether Akrotiri was a Minoan colony, a Cycladic town that had adopted Minoan culture, or something in between is debated. What is clear is that by the 17th century BC, Minoan influence in the Cyclades was pervasive. The Greek mainland was undergoing its own transformation during this period. The Mycenaean civilization was emerging, centered on fortified palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes. The early Mycenaeans were warriors, their graves filled with weapons, swords and daggers, spears and armor. But they were also traders and patrons of the arts, and they were deeply influenced by Minoan culture. The famous shaft graves at Mycenae, dating to around 1600 BC, contain astonishing wealth: gold masks and jewelry, weapons inlaid with scenes of hunting and battle, vessels of gold and silver. Many of these objects are Minoan in style, either imported from Crete or made by Minoan craftsmen working on the mainland. The Mycenaeans were learning from the Minoans, adopting their art, their religious symbols, their architecture. Minoan frescoes appear in Mycenaean palaces. Minoan styles of pottery are imitated. The Tholos tomb, a circular stone-built burial chamber, was a Minoan invention adopted by the Mycenaeans and elaborated into the grand beehive tombs, like the treasury of Atreus. But influence flowed in both directions. By the late Palace period, Mycenaean pottery begins to appear in Crete, evidence of contact and exchange. The relationship between Minoans and Mycenaeans is one of the great questions of Aegean archaeology. Were the Minoans the cultural superiors, the civilized traders and artists, while the Mycenaeans were warrior upstarts learning from their betters? Or was the relationship more balanced, more complex, with both cultures influencing each other, competing and cooperating in the same commercial and political networks? The Minoans may have established trading posts, or even colonies beyond the Aegean. At Miletus on the Anatolian coast, a substantial Minoan presence has been attested, including a cemetery with Minoan-style burials. Rhodes and other Dokanese islands show Minoan influence. Even in the western Mediterranean, there are hints possible Minoan pottery in Sicily, though the evidence is thin and contested. The Minoans were sailors, explorers, traders ranging far and wide, carrying their goods and their culture to distant shores. What did they trade? Olive oil was a major export, carried in large transport jars, amphorae, to markets across the Mediterranean. Wine was another. Crete's vineyards produced a surplus that could be traded for goods the island lacked. Textiles were important. Though being organic, they rarely survive in the archaeological record. We know from Linear A tablets that wool and flax were collected and processed in large quantities, spun and woven into cloth. Minoan textiles may have been luxury goods, finely woven, dyed with expensive pigments like murex purple. Pottery was traded, both as containers for other goods and as valuable objects in their own right. The fine painted wares of the marine and floral styles were prized, appearing in elite contexts across the Aegean. In return, the Minoans imported metals, copper and tin, for bronze, gold and silver for jewelry and prestige objects. Ivory came from Egypt and Syria, carved into seals, figurines and decorative inlays. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone so prized in the ancient world, came from Afghanistan, traveling thousands of miles through the trade networks of the Near East before reaching Crete. Amber from the distant Baltic appears occasionally in Minoan contexts, evidence of trade routes stretching across Europe. Ostrich eggs from Africa, exotic and rare, have been found in Cretan tombs, transformed into ritual vessels, their shells carved and decorated. The sea was not just a highway for goods, it was a highway for ideas. Religious symbols, artistic motifs, technologies, stories, all traveled the same routes as the amphorae of oil and the ingots of copper. The Minoans were part of a cosmopolitan world, connected to Egypt and the Near East, aware of the great kingdoms and empires that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. They were not isolated, not provincial. They were players in the great game of Bronze Age politics and commerce, their palaces centers of wealth and power, their ships known in every port from the Nile Delta to the Syrian coast. And yet, for all their connections, the Minoans remained distinctive. Their art, their architecture, their religion, all bore the stamp of something uniquely Cretan, a culture that had developed its own character, its own vision of what civilization could be. They were influenced by Egypt and the Near East, but they were not copies. They took what they needed, what interested them, and made it their own, blending foreign elements with indigenous traditions to create something new. The sea made the Minoans, but it would also, in time, bring disaster. For the sea carried not just traders and goods, but storms and earthquakes, volcanic eruptions and tidal waves. And in the middle of the second millennium BC, the sea would bring catastrophe on a scale the Minoans had never known. And then one day, the mountain exploded. The eruption of Thera was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, a cataclysm that ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The eruption column rose perhaps 20 miles into the sky, a pillar of fire and darkness visible for hundreds of miles. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and rock, roared down the mountainside, incinerating everything in their path. The island's center collapsed, creating a caldera, a vast circular bay where the mountain had been. Tsunamis radiated outward, waves tens of meters high, crashing into the coasts of the surrounding islands. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean. A grey snow that blanketed the sea, darkened the sky, choked the lungs of anyone caught in the open. The town of Akrotiri was buried, entombed beneath meters of volcanic ash and pumice. The people, miraculously, seem to have escaped. No bodies have been found in the ruins. They must have fled before the final eruption, warned perhaps by earlier tremors, by the earthquakes and steam vents that would have preceded the climactic explosion. They took little with them. Pottery and tools remain in the houses, beds and storage jars. The detritus of daily life abandoned in haste. Where they went, whether they survived, we do not know. The island was uninhabitable afterward, buried and desolate, a wasteland of ash and pumice. It would remain so for generations. The eruption of Thera has been dated, through analysis of tree rings and ice cores, to around 1628 BC, give or take a few years. This places it in the middle of the Minoan Second Palace period, a time of prosperity and cultural flowering. The question that has haunted archaeologists ever since the eruption was linked to the Minoan collapse is simple. Did Thera destroy Minoan civilization? The answer, as with most things concerning the Minoans, is complicated. The eruption undoubtedly affected Crete. Ash from Thera has been found in layers of soil across the island, evidence that the ash cloud reached Crete and deposited a layer of tephra across the landscape. The ash fall would have been heaviest on the eastern and northern parts of the island, closest to Thera. But even in the west and south, the sky would have darkened, the sun obscured for days or weeks. The ash would have damaged crops, contaminated water sources, made the air difficult to breathe. Livestock would have suffered. The harvest would have failed. Then there were the tsunamis. Models of the eruption suggest that waves generated by the caldera collapse could have reached the northern coast of Crete within 30 minutes. Waves perhaps 10 to 15 meters high, devastating coastal settlements, destroying ships in harbor, flooding low-lying areas. The palace at Knossos, several miles inland, would have been safe, but towns and villages along the coast would have been hit hard. Evidence of tsunami damage has been claimed at several sites on the northern coast, though the evidence is contested, complicated by the difficulty of distinguishing tsunami deposits from other types of coastal flooding. And yet, Crete survived. The palaces were not destroyed by the eruption. Knossos continued to function, its scribes recording deliveries and offerings, its workshops producing pottery and jewelry. The same is true of the other palaces, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros. There is no widespread destruction horizon that corresponds to the date of the Thera eruption. No layer of ash thick enough to indicate catastrophic burial. No sudden abandonment of sites across the island. What we see instead is resilience. The Minoans rebuilt after the eruption, repaired the damage, adapted to the new conditions. The ash fall, while damaging, was not lethal to the civilization as a whole. Crops failed, but fields could be cleared, new seeds planted. Coastal settlements damaged by tsunamis could be rebuilt. Ships lost could be replaced. The Minoans had survived earthquakes before, they would survive this. But the eruption may have had longer-term effects, subtler and harder to detect. The ash fall would have disrupted agriculture for several seasons, leading to food shortages, weakening the population, undermining the authority of the palaces, whose legitimacy rested in part on their ability to manage resources and provide for their people. The loss of ships and sailors, of coastal infrastructure, would have damaged trade networks, reducing the flow of imports and exports, cutting the Minoans off, at least temporarily, from the wider Mediterranean world. The psychological impact may have been significant as well. A disaster on this scale, the sky darkening, the earth shaking, the sea rising, would have seemed like the anger of the gods, a judgment, a warning. Trust in the old certainties, in the palaces and their rituals, may have been shaken. Some scholars have argued that the Thera eruption weakened Minoan civilization, making it vulnerable to external pressures, invasion perhaps, or internal strife. Others see it as largely irrelevant, a natural disaster that Crete weathered and moved on from. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The eruption was a shock, a trauma, but not a fatal blow. The Minoans endured, but they were changed, weakened perhaps, made more vulnerable to the challenges that would come in the centuries ahead. Walking through the ruins of Akrotiri today, preserved beneath the ash like a moment frozen in time, you can feel the weight of what was lost. The frescoes are intact, their colors still vibrant, blue and yellow and red, images of life and beauty cut short by catastrophe. The town was prosperous, sophisticated, connected to the wider world, and then it was gone, buried, its people scattered, its future erased. Thera stands as a reminder of the fragility of civilization, of how quickly prosperity can turn to disaster, how the earth itself can reshape human history in a single cataclysmic moment. But Crete endured. The palaces stood, the ships sailed again, the frescoes were repainted, the rituals resumed. For 2 more centuries, Minoan civilization would continue, reaching perhaps its greatest heights in the decades after Thera, producing the finest pottery, the most beautiful frescoes, the most elaborate architecture. The eruption was a catastrophe, but it was not the end. The end, when it came, would be slower, more ambiguous, harder to explain. The early Mycenaean world is revealed most vividly in the shaft graves at Mycenae, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876. These are royal burials, dating to around 1600 BC, filled with astonishing wealth, gold masks covering the faces of the dead, swords and daggers inlaid with scenes of lions, hunting and warriors fighting, vessels of gold and silver, jewelry of exquisite craftsmanship. The wealth is staggering, far beyond anything seen in Greece before, evidence of a society that had suddenly accumulated vast resources, perhaps through trade, perhaps through war, perhaps through both. What is striking about the shaft grave goods is how much of the material is Minoan in style. Many of the objects are either imports from Crete or made by Minoan craftsmen working on the mainland. The gold vessels, the intricate jewelry, the bronze weapons with their elaborate inlays, all show Minoan influence, Minoan techniques, Minoan aesthetics. The early Mycenaeans were learning from the Minoans, adopting their art, their symbols, their luxury goods, using them to signal their own power and status. But the Mycenaeans were not simply imitating. They were adapting, taking Minoan forms and infusing them with their own values, their own culture. The Minoans had no great tradition of warfare, at least not one visible in their art. The Mycenaeans, by contrast, were obsessed with martial prowess. Their graves are filled with weapons, swords and spears, daggers and shields, chariots and armor. Their palaces, unlike those of Crete, were fortified, surrounded by massive stone walls that still stand today at Mycenae and Tiryns, walls so large that later Greeks called them Cyclopean, believing that only giants could have built them. The Mycenaean palaces were different from the Minoan ones, in other ways as well. They were organized around a megaron, a large rectangular hall with a central hearth, a throne at one end, and a columned porch at the entrance. This was the heart of the palace, the place where the king held court, where the warriors feasted, where power was displayed and reinforced through ritual and hospitality. The Mycenaean megaron was a transplant from older Greek traditions, not borrowed from Crete, though the decoration of these halls, the frescoes, the painted floors, the use of columns, shows clear Minoan influence. By the 16th and 15th centuries BC, Mycenaean power was growing. The palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes were becoming centers of wealth and administration, managing territories, collecting taxes, maintaining armies. The Mycenaeans were literate, having adopted the Linear B script, a Greek adaptation of the Minoan Linear A, which they used to keep records on clay tablets, just as the Minoans did. These tablets, thousands of which survive, reveal a society organized for war and production, a bureaucratic state that tracked everything from chariot wheels to sheep to offerings for the gods. The Mycenaeans were also traders and seafarers. Their pottery appears across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Syria, evidence of commercial networks that rivaled those of the Minoans. Mycenaean merchants traded olive oil and wine, textiles and pottery, in exchange for metals and luxury goods. They established trading posts in the Aegean Islands, on the Anatolian coast, perhaps even in Cyprus and the Levant. The relationship between the Mycenaeans and the Minoans during this period is complex and much debated. Were they rivals competing for control of trade routes and resources? Were they partners cooperating in commercial ventures, their elites intermarrying, their cultures blending? Or were they simply two civilizations existing side by side, influencing each other, but remaining distinct? The evidence is ambiguous. Minoan influence on the Mycenaean world is undeniable, visible in art, architecture, religion. But by the late Palace period, the flow of influence was beginning to reverse. Mycenaean pottery appears in Crete, at first in small quantities. Then more and more, Mycenaean styles begin to show up in Minoan frescoes. There are hints of Mycenaean presence on the island, burials with Mycenaean-style weapons, pottery that blends Minoan and Mycenaean elements. Some scholars have argued for a Mycenaean conquest of Crete, an invasion sometime in the 15th century BC that brought the island under mainland control. Others see a more gradual process, a slow infiltration, perhaps driven by Mycenaean merchants and mercenaries, settlers and traders, who established themselves in Crete and over time gained influence, perhaps even marrying into Minoan elite families, until they held positions of power. The truth is probably that the relationship varied over time and from place to place. In some parts of Crete, Minoan elites may have welcomed Mycenaean contact, seeing it as an opportunity for trade and alliance. In others, Mycenaean presence may have been resented, resisted, perhaps even violently opposed. The island was not politically unified. Each palace seems to have controlled its own territory, and there is no evidence of a single king ruling all of Crete. The relationship with the mainland would have been managed locally by individual palace centers, each pursuing its own interests. What is clear is that by the mid-15th century BC, the cultural landscape of the Aegean was shifting. The Minoans were no longer the only great power in the region. The Mycenaeans had arrived, wealthy and ambitious, their palaces fortified, their warriors trained, their ships ranging far and wide. The balance of power was changing, and Crete would soon feel the consequences. Around 1450 BC, the palaces of Crete were destroyed. Fire swept through Phistos, through Malea, through Zakros on the far eastern coast. The destruction was sudden, violent, catastrophic. The palaces burned, their timber frameworks collapsing, their upper stories crashing down into the rooms below. The heat was intense enough to bake the clay tablets in the archives, preserving them in their final moments. Records of deliveries and offerings, inventories and accounts, the bureaucratic minutiae of palace administration frozen in time. Only Knossos survived. The palace at Knossos was damaged in the destructions of 1450 BC, but it was not abandoned. It was rebuilt, repaired, its halls and storerooms restored, its functions resumed. But something had changed. When the palace was reoccupied, the language of its administration was no longer the unknown tongue of Linear A. It was Greek. The tablets found in the final destruction of Knossos, around 1380 BC, are written in Linear B, the script of the Mycenaeans. The names on the tablets are Greek names. The gods mentioned in the offering lists are Greek gods: Poseidon, Zeus, Athena, Dionysus. The palace of Knossos had become a Mycenaean palace, the seat of Greek-speaking rulers, the administrative center of an island now under mainland control. How this happened is one of the great mysteries of Aegean archaeology. Was there an invasion, a Mycenaean conquest of Crete? The destruction of the palaces in 1450 BC suggests violence, organized and widespread. An invading force, perhaps a coalition of Mycenaean kings, may have attacked the island, destroying the palaces one by one, only to install themselves at Knossos as the new rulers. This is the conquest theory, and it has much to recommend it. The destructions are contemporary. The shift to Linear B at Knossos is sudden. The archaeology shows continuity at Knossos, but discontinuity at the other palace sites, which were never rebuilt. But there are problems with the conquest theory. There is no widespread destruction of settlements across Crete, no layers of ash and burning in towns and villages, no mass graves, no evidence of the kind of large-scale warfare that an invasion would entail. The countryside seems to have continued much as before, farms and villas operating, pottery being made, life going on. If there was an invasion, it was targeted, focused on the palaces themselves, aimed at decapitating the Minoan state, while leaving the rest of the island relatively intact. An alternative theory suggests internal collapse, perhaps triggered by the Thera eruption's long-term effects, by economic crisis, by political instability. The palaces may have fallen to internal strife, rival factions within Crete fighting for power, until one group, perhaps allied with Mycenaean warriors, or supported by Mycenaean patrons, emerged victorious at Knossos. The Linear B tablets, in this view, reflect not conquest, but cultural assimilation, the adoption of Greek language and administration by a Minoan elite that had been increasingly influenced by Mycenaean norms. A third possibility is that the Mycenaeans were already present on Crete before 1450 BC, perhaps as traders or mercenaries, perhaps even as ruling elites who had married into Minoan families and gained power gradually over generations. The destructions of 1450 BC might represent a consolidation of power, a violent assertion of Mycenaean authority that eliminated rival palace centers and concentrated control at Knossos. The truth is uncertain, contested, debated. What is clear is that after 1450 BC, Knossos was different. The palace was still magnificent, its architecture still impressive, its storerooms still filled with goods, but it was no longer purely Minoan. The throne room, where a gypsum throne still sits against the wall, may have held a Mycenaean king. The archives, written in Linear B, recorded transactions in Greek, using Greek terminology, Greek systems of measurement and accounting. The religion, too, shows signs of change. Greek gods appear in the tablets. The offerings are still made, the rituals still performed, but the names have changed. Yet much remained Minoan. The architecture of the palace was not rebuilt in Mycenaean style. There was no megaroon, no fortification walls. The frescoes continued to depict Minoan themes: griffins and dolphins, gardens and processions. The craftsmen were still producing Minoan-style pottery, though now alongside Mycenaean forms. The culture was hybrid, blended, a fusion of Minoan and Mycenaean elements that created something new, something that was neither purely Minoan nor purely Mycenaean. The tablets from Knossos, baked in the final destruction around 1380 BC, offer a glimpse into this hybrid world. They record hundreds of sheep being sent to various locations, chariots being assembled, offerings made to the gods. They list personnel, shepherds and bronzesmiths, bath attendants and wheat grinders, men and women whose labor supported the palace economy. Some of the names are Greek, others are not, possibly Minoan names preserved in Greek script, evidence of a mixed population, of continuity alongside change. The palace controlled a substantial territory, perhaps most of central and northern Crete. Outlying settlements sent goods to Knossos: wool and grain, oil and wine, recorded in the tablets, redistributed by the palace administration. The system was similar to the old Minoan palace economy. but now run by Greek-speaking bureaucrats, using Greek accounting methods, serving Greek-speaking rulers. For 70 years, from 1450 to 1380 BC, Knossos functioned as a Mycenaean administrative center. It was prosperous, powerful, connected to the wider Mycenaean world. Mycenaean pottery from Knossos appears across the Aegean. The palace may have been allied with, or subordinate to one of the great Mycenaean kings on the mainland, part of the network of palaces that would in later legend unite to sail against Troy. And then around 1380 BC, the palace burned for the final time. The destruction was total. The upper stories collapsed. The archives were baked into permanence. When the fires cooled, the palace was a ruin, never to be rebuilt. The age of the palaces was over. Knossos was never rebuilt. The ruins stood open to the sky, slowly weathering, slowly being buried by wind and rain, by vegetation creeping back over the stones. The other palace sites, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, had already been abandoned for decades. Now Knossos joined them, a ghost, a memory, a place of broken walls and fallen columns. What happened? The question has haunted archaeologists for over a century. The destruction was violent. Fire consumed the palace, intense enough to crack stone and bake clay. But was it an earthquake? The same tectonic instability that had destroyed the palaces before? Was it an invasion? An attack by external enemies? Was it internal strife, rebellion against the Mycenaean rulers? A final assertion of Minoan identity against foreign control? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. There are no bodies in the ruins, no weapons, no signs of battle. The fire seems to have consumed the palace completely, leaving little behind but the baked tablets and the collapsed architecture. Earthquake is a possibility. Crete sits on a major fault line, and destructive earthquakes are common. But earthquakes do not usually burn palaces so thoroughly. Fire requires fuel, timber, and oil, and the intensity of the blaze suggests something more than accidental conflagration. Invasion is another possibility. The late 14th and 13th centuries BC were a time of upheaval across the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia was at war with Egypt. Raiders and migrants were on the move, destabilizing kingdoms and trade routes. The so-called Sea Peoples, still mysterious, still debated, were beginning their campaigns that would by 1200 BC bring down empires and cities from Anatolia to Egypt. Crete was not isolated from these larger currents. An attack by external enemies, pirates, raiders, a hostile power, could have led to the destruction of Knossos. Or perhaps the answer lies within Crete itself. The Mycenaean occupation may not have been universally accepted. There may have been resentment, resistance, a desire among some Minoans to reclaim their island from foreign rulers. A rebellion, a civil war, could have led to the burning of the palace, the expulsion or killing of the Mycenaean elite. The fact that Knossos was not rebuilt might support this. If the destruction was the result of internal strife, there may have been no one left with the authority or resources to rebuild. No political structure capable of mobilizing the labor and materials required. Whatever the cause, the effect was profound. With the fall of Knossos, centralized administration on Crete came to an end. The palace economy, with its complex networks of collection and redistribution, its scribes and records, its control over craft production and trade, collapsed. The island fragmented, reverting to a more localized, village-based society. Pottery production declined in quality and quantity. Monumental architecture ceased. Writing disappeared. Linear B tablets are no longer produced, and literacy seems to have been lost. This is the beginning of what is sometimes called the post-palatial period, the centuries from 1380 to around 1100 BC, when Crete existed in the shadow of its former glory. Life went on, of course. People still farmed, still herded sheep, still made pottery and tools. Settlements continued to exist, some of them quite substantial. But the island was no longer a major power, no longer a center of trade and culture. It had become peripheral, a backwater, its great days behind it. And yet some continuity remained. At Knossos itself, a settlement persisted in the ruins of the palace. People living among the broken walls, perhaps venerating the site as sacred, as the home of ancestors, the place where kings once ruled. Other sites show continuity as well. Shrines that remained in use, caves where offerings were still made, cemeteries where the dead were buried in the old ways. The wider Mycenaean world was also in decline. On the mainland, the palaces continued to function through the 13th century BC, but signs of stress were everywhere. New fortifications were built, walls extended, defensive preparations made. Trade networks were disrupted. The palatial economies were straining, perhaps overextended, unable to adapt to changing conditions. And then around 1200 BC, the Mycenaean palaces too were destroyed, Hylos burned, Mycenaean Tiryns damaged, Thebes abandoned. The palace at Mycenaean survived for a time, but diminished, weakened, a shadow of its former self. This was the end of the Bronze Age in the Aegean, a widespread collapse that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire fell, cities across the Levant were destroyed. Egypt survived but was diminished, beset by invasions and internal strife. Trade routes collapsed. Literacy was lost in many places. Populations declined. The great palace civilizations of the Bronze Age, Mycenaean, Hittite, Canaanite, disappeared, replaced by smaller, simpler societies, by a dark age that would last for centuries. Crete was part of this collapse, but also separate from it. The island had already fallen decades before the wider crisis. By 1200 BC, Crete was already in its dark age, already fragmented, already struggling. The final collapse of the Mycenaean world on the mainland left Crete even more isolated, cut off from the trade networks that had once connected it to the wider Mediterranean. And yet the Minoans were not entirely gone. Their culture, their art, their religion, all left traces, echoes that would persist through the Dark Ages and into the new civilizations that would eventually emerge. The Greeks who settled in Crete after the collapse remembered the palaces, remembered the greatness that had been. They told stories, passed down through generations, stories of King Minos and the labyrinth, of Daedalus and Icarus, of Theseus and the Minotaur. These stories were not history, not in any straightforward sense, but they were memory, distorted and mythologized, yet rooted in something real, in the palaces that had stood, in the power that had been, in the civilization that had risen and fallen on this island at the edge of the world. Centuries after the palaces fell, after the frescoes faded and the stones tumbled, the Greeks remembered Crete, not as it was, a complex, bureaucratic, palace-based society organized around trade and ritual, but as something stranger, more mythic, more terrible. They remembered a king named Minos who ruled the island with absolute power, who commanded a fleet that dominated the Aegean, who exacted tribute from Athens in the form of young men and women sent to die in a labyrinth beneath his palace. The myth of Theseus and the Minotaur is one of the most famous stories from Greek mythology, told and retold by poets and playwrights, painted on vases, carved in stone, adapted and elaborated over centuries. The basic story is well known. King Minos of Crete, angered by the Athenians for some offense, demands a tribute. 7 young men and 7 young women, sent every 9 years to Crete, to be devoured by the Minotaur, a monstrous creature, half man and half bull, imprisoned in a labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos. The Minotaur was the offspring of Minos' wife, Pasiphae, and a sacred bull sent by Poseidon. The god had given the bull to Minos as a sign of favor, expecting it to be sacrificed. But Minos, entranced by the animal's beauty, kept it, sacrificing another bull in its place. Poseidon, angered by this deception, cursed Pasiphae with an unnatural desire for the bull. She enlisted the help of Daedalus, the master craftsman, who built a hollow wooden cow in which she could hide. The bull, deceived, mated with her, and from this union, the Minotaur was born, a creature of shame and horror, hidden away in the labyrinth Daedalus constructed beneath the palace, a maze so complex that no one who entered could ever find their way out. When the third tribute was due, Theseus, Prince of Athens, volunteered to go, determined to kill the Minotaur and end the terrible practice. On Crete, he met Ariadne, daughter of Minos, who fell in love with him. She gave him a ball of thread, which he unwound as he entered the labyrinth, allowing him to retrace his steps after slaying the monster. Theseus killed the Minotaur, followed the thread back to the entrance, and escaped with Ariadne and the other Athenian youths, sailing away under cover of darkness. The myth is rich with symbolic resonance. The labyrinth, the thread, the monster at the center, all have been interpreted in countless ways, as metaphors for initiation, for the journey into the self, for the triumph of civilization over barbarism, of reason over chaos. But the myth also preserves cultural memory, echoes of the real Minoan past. The Palace of Knossos, with its complex plan, its hundreds of rooms, its winding corridors and staircases, its storage magazines and workshops, could easily have seemed like a labyrinth to later Greeks who visited the ruins. The word labyrinth itself may derive from labris, the double-headed axe that was a sacred symbol at Knossos, appearing on pillars and pottery, seals and frescoes. The palace was the house of the labris, the labyrinth. King Minos himself may be a memory of real Minoan rulers. The name Minos could have been a title, like Pharaoh in Egypt, rather than the name of an individual. Later Greek traditions speak of two Minoses, an elder, a wise lawgiver, and a younger, a tyrant. This may reflect historical reality, a memory of different rulers, or different phases of Minoan power. The tribute of youths from Athens may reflect historical relations between Crete and the mainland. The Minoans were a major power in the Aegean during the 2nd millennium BC, and Athens in its early days may have been subordinate to Crete, required to send goods or people as tribute. The myth transforms this political relationship into a story of human sacrifice, of youths fed to a monster, but the underlying reality, Cretan dominance over the Aegean, is preserved. The Minotaur itself, the bullman, is clearly connected to the Minoan fascination with bulls. Bulls were sacred animals, symbols of power and fertility, central to Minoan religion. The frescoes of bull leaping, the horns of consecration, the bull sacrifices, all of this was real, part of Minoan ritual life. The Greeks, encountering these symbols in the ruins, or hearing stories about them, may have transformed the sacred bull into a monster, a creature that had to be slain, just as Greek heroes in myth always slay monsters. Daedalus, the master craftsman, who built the labyrinth and the wooden cow, is another figure who may have roots in Minoan reality. The Minoans were master builders, engineers who designed complex drainage systems, multi-story buildings, sophisticated plumbing. Daedalus may be a mythologized memory of these builders, of the architects and craftsmen who created the palaces. The myth of Daedalus also includes the story of his son, Icarus, who flew too close to the sun on wings made of feathers and wax, falling to his death in the sea. This is a story about hubris, about the dangers of overreaching, but it may also reflect something about Minoan aspirations, about a civilization that reached great heights, literally, in the case of their multi-story buildings, and then fell. Other myths connect Crete to the wider Greek world. Europa, a Phoenician princess, was abducted by Zeus in the form of a bull, and brought to Crete, where she bore him sons, including Minos. This myth reflects Crete's position as a bridge between the Near East and Greece, a place where Eastern and Western influences met and mingled. The myth of Zeus's birth also takes place on Crete. According to the story, Zeus was born in a cave on Crete, hidden by his mother Rhea to protect him from his father Kronos, who devoured his children. The infant Zeus was raised in the cave, nursed by the goat Amalthea, protected by the Koreas, warrior spirits who clashed their shields to drown out his cries. The Dictaean cave and the Idaean cave, both on Crete, were identified in antiquity as the birthplace of Zeus, and both show evidence of ritual activity dating back to the Minoan period. These myths are not history, they are stories, shaped by centuries of retelling, by the needs and values of the societies that told them. But they preserve memory, however distorted, of a real civilization that once dominated the Aegean, that built great palaces, that worshipped bulls, that exerted power over the islands and the mainland. The Minoans became myth, but in becoming myth, they achieved a kind of immortality, living on in the stories of the Greeks, shaping the imagination of Western culture for millennia to come. For 3,000 years, the Minoans were forgotten. The palaces crumbled, buried under soil and vegetation, their walls reduced to rubble, their frescoes faded to dust. The island of Crete became a backwater, passed from empire to empire, Roman, Byzantine, Venetian, Ottoman, its ancient past unknown, its glories sleeping beneath the earth. The myths remained, passed down through Greek literature, but no one connected them to the ruins that occasionally surfaced when farmers ploughed their fields or builders dug foundations. In the 19th century, that began to change. Archaeology was emerging as a discipline, driven by adventurers and scholars who traveled to the Mediterranean in search of the classical past. Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy and Mycenae, uncovering cities that had been thought purely mythical. Others followed, digging at Olympia, Delphi, Athens, bringing to light the material remains of ancient Greece. Crete attracted attention as well. Visitors to the island in the 1800s noticed ruins, particularly at Knossos, where the local people called a low hill Kafala, the head. Large stones were visible on the surface, and farmers ploughing the hillside occasionally turned up pottery, seals, fragments of frescoes. In 1878, a merchant from Heraklion named Minos Kalokarinos excavated part of the site, uncovering storage magazines with enormous pithoi still in place. His work was limited, but it proved that something significant lay beneath the hill. The man who would bring Knossos and the Minoans to the world's attention was Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, wealthy, well-connected, obsessed with the idea of a pre-Greek civilization in the Aegean. Evans had been interested in Crete for years, intrigued by seal stones that appeared in antique shops in Athens. Tiny carved gems with images, unlike anything from classical Greece. Abstract symbols, animals, human figures in strange costumes. The seals bore inscriptions in an unknown script, and Evans became convinced that they were evidence of a literate civilization predating the Greeks. In 1900, Evans purchased the site at Knossos and began excavations. What he uncovered astonished the world. Within weeks, he had exposed parts of a vast palace, corridors and stairways, storage rooms filled with giant jars, frescoes still clinging to the walls. He found thousands of clay tablets inscribed with two different scripts, one pictographic, the other linear. He uncovered a throne room with a gypsum throne still in place, the oldest throne in Europe. He found evidence of sophisticated plumbing, of multi-story architecture, of a civilization that was clearly advanced, clearly literate, clearly unlike anything known from early Greece. Evans worked at Knossos for over 30 years, excavating, reconstructing, interpreting. He gave the civilization a name, Minoan, after the legendary King Minos. And he created a narrative of Minoan history, dividing it into periods based on pottery styles, identifying cultural phases, constructing a chronology that is still used, with modifications today. Evans' work was groundbreaking, but it was also controversial. His reconstructions of the palace, concrete columns, repainted frescoes, rebuilt walls, have been criticized as fanciful, as imposing his own vision onto the ruins. He recreated what he thought the palace should look like, based on his interpretations of the fragments he found, but his reconstructions went far beyond what the evidence strictly warranted. The famous frescoes, the Priest King, the dolphin fresco, the scenes of bull leaping, are largely modern creations, pieced together from fragments, with large portions repainted by the artists Evans employed. Evans' interpretations were also shaped by his own assumptions and biases. He saw the Minoans as a peaceful matriarchal society, ruled by priest kings, devoted to the worship of a mother goddess. He contrasted them with the Mycenaeans, whom he saw as warlike and patriarchal, as conquerors who eventually overwhelmed the gentle Minoans. This narrative, while appealing, is not supported by the evidence. The Minoans were not pacifists. They had weapons, they built defensive structures, they engaged in trade that could easily turn to raiding. The idea of a mother goddess is based on the figurines of women holding snakes, but we have no direct evidence that the Minoans worshipped a single great goddess, rather than multiple deities. Despite these criticisms, Evans's work remains foundational. He brought the Minoans into the modern consciousness, revealed a civilization that had been lost for millennia, demonstrated that the Aegean had a rich, complex history before the classical Greeks. His excavations at Knossos were followed by others, at Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, and at dozens of smaller sites across Crete. Each new excavation added to the picture, complicating it, challenging Evans's interpretations, revealing the diversity and complexity of Minoan culture. One of the great breakthroughs in Minoan studies came in 1952, when Michael Ventris, a British architect and amateur linguist, deciphered Linear B. Ventris demonstrated that Linear B was an early form of Greek used by the Mycenaeans to keep administrative records. This was a revelation, confirming that the Mycenaeans were Greek speakers, that they had controlled Knossos in its final phase, that the palace's last tablets were written in a language ancestral to classical Greek. But Linear A, the earlier script used by the Minoans themselves, remains undeciphered. Thousands of tablets in Linear A have been found, but the language they record is unknown. Some scholars believe it may be related to the Etruscan language of Italy, others to the languages of Anatolia, others to no known language family at all. Until Linear A is deciphered, much of Minoan civilization remains opaque, locked away in texts we can see but cannot read. Modern archaeology has moved beyond Evans's methods. Excavations today use stratigraphic techniques, careful recording, multidisciplinary approaches that incorporate specialists in pottery, metallurgy, botany, zoology, chemistry. New technologies, ground-penetrating radar, 3D modeling, DNA analysis, are revealing details about Minoan life that Evans could never have imagined. And yet, the Minoans remain mysterious. We know so much more than Evans did, but also, in some ways, less. Evans was confident in his interpretations, certain of his narrative. Modern scholars are more cautious, more aware of the limits of the evidence, more willing to acknowledge uncertainty. The Minoans are real, their palaces and pottery and frescoes tangible proof of their existence. But their thoughts, their beliefs, their stories, the things that would make them fully human to us, remain elusive, fragments of a language we cannot read, symbols we cannot fully decode. The sun sets over Knossos slowly, the light turning golden and then orange. casting long shadows across the ruins. The tourists have gone, the site quiet, except for the wind moving through the cypress trees, the distant sound of traffic from Heraklion. Standing in the central courtyard, surrounded by the reconstructed columns and the ancient stones, it is possible to feel the weight of time, the long arc of history that connects this place to the present. The Minoans were Europe's first great civilization, the first to build palaces, the first to develop writing, the first to create a state complex enough to require bureaucracy and record-keeping. They were the first Europeans to engage with the wider Mediterranean world on equal terms, trading with Egypt and the Near East. Their ships known in every port from the Nile Delta to the Syrian coast. They were the first to create monumental art that celebrated the natural world, dolphins and lilies, octopuses and birds, rather than the deeds of kings and the conquests of armies. Their influence on later Greek civilization was profound. The Mycenaeans, who would dominate the Aegean in the late Bronze Age, learned from the Minoans, adopted their art and architecture, their religious symbols and administrative techniques. The Greeks of the classical period remembered Crete as a place of ancient glory, the home of King Minos, the lawgiver, the birthplace of Zeus. The myths they told of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, of Daedalus and Icarus, were shaped by memories of the Minoan past, distorted and mythologized, but rooted in something real. Through the Greeks, Minoan influence spread further. The Romans inherited Greek culture, and through Rome, it spread across Europe. The Renaissance rediscovered classical Greece, and with it, the myths and stories that preserved echoes of the Minoans. Modern Europe, shaped by the classical tradition, by the myths and art and literature of ancient Greece, is heir to the Minoans, whether it knows it or not. But the Minoans also matter in their own right, not just as precursors to the Greeks, but as a civilization with its own character, its own achievements, its own way of being in the world. They remind us that civilization can take many forms, that power need not always rest on military might, that beauty and craftsmanship can be as important as conquest and empire. The Minoan palaces were not fortresses. They were not built to dominate, to intimidate, to project power through sheer mass and strength. They were built to facilitate, to store and redistribute goods, to house rituals, to provide spaces for the community to gather. Their walls were decorated not with scenes of battle and triumph, but with images of nature and ceremony, of young people leaping over bulls, of processions bearing gifts, of dolphins swimming through blue seas. This does not mean the Minoans were pacifists or utopians. They had weapons. They traded and competed. They exerted control over resources and people. But their culture, as revealed through archaeology, suggests a different emphasis, a different set of values than the warrior societies that would follow them. The Minoan religion too seems to have been focused on nature, on fertility, on the cycles of life and death, growth and decay. The goddess or goddesses they worshipped were connected to the earth, to mountains and caves, to the sea and its creatures. The bull, sacred and powerful, was honored through ritual, through the dangerous sport of bull leaping, through sacrifice. The dead were buried communally, their bones mingled together, continuing in death the bonds that had connected them in life. And then, it ended. The palaces burned, the scripts were lost, the civilization collapsed. But the collapse was not total. The island endured, its people continuing to farm and herd, to make pottery and tools, to worship at shrines and caves. Minoan culture did not vanish overnight. It faded, gradually, over centuries, blending with new influences, transforming into something else. It's the Greeks who settled in Crete, after the Dark Ages, inherited the island's past, its ruins and its myths. They told stories about the palaces, stories that grew in the telling, that became more fantastic, more symbolic, until the real Minoans were lost beneath the weight of legend. But the legends preserved memory, however distorted, of a civilization that had been great, that had built and created and ruled. Walking through the ruins of Knossos, through the columned halls and painted rooms, through the magazines with their rows of giant jars, it is hard not to feel the presence of the past, the ghosts of the people who lived here, who worked and worshipped, who celebrated and mourned, who built something that lasted 1,000 years. They are gone, their language unread, their names unknown, their thoughts and dreams lost, but the stones remain, and the frescoes, and the pottery, and the seals, enough to know that they were here, that they mattered, that they created something beautiful and complex and worthy of remembering. The Minoans were the beginning, the first flowering of civilization in Europe, the first attempt to build something greater than the sum of scattered villages and small communities. They succeeded, for a time creating a culture that influenced the entire Aegean, that traded with empires, that produced art of astonishing beauty, and when they fell, they left behind ruins and myths, fragments and questions, a legacy that has fascinated and puzzled scholars for over a century. The mountains of Crete rise dark against the evening sky, their peaks still touched by the last light of the sun. The sea beyond is calm, reflecting the colors of the sunset, the same sea that carried Minoan ships to Egypt and Cyprus, to the Cyclades and the mainland. The olive groves spread across the hillsides, ancient trees rooted in the same soil that fed the Minoans, their fruit pressed into oil just as it was 3,000 years ago. The Minoans are gone, but Crete remains. And the questions they left behind remain as well. Who were they? What did they believe? How did they understand themselves and their place in the world? Why did they build palaces without walls? Why did they leap over bulls? Why did they bury their dead together in communal tombs? We may never know the answers. Linear A may never be deciphered. The Minoan language may remain forever unknown. But the search continues. The excavations go on, and each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, another fragment of the past recovered from the earth. The Minoans remind us that the past is not dead, that it lives on in the stones and the soil, in the myths we tell and the questions we ask, in the endless human effort to understand where we came from and who we are. They were Europe's first great civilization, and they will not be forgotten.